Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. If you're new to my channel, my name is Todd DeWald and I'm a wildlife photographer based out of Connecticut, and I just recently obtained my degree in fisheries and wildlife science from Oregon State University. So it is my goal on this channel to share some of the knowledge that I've gained through that degree and share it with you so that together we can become better wildlife photographers and better naturalists together. So in today's video, I am out in a mixed forest, a deciduous conifer forest. There's some large white pines that are shooting through the canopy, as well as some birches and maples. And today I am out here to talk to you about 7 of the most helpful tips and techniques that I think there are to, number 1, find wildlife, and number 2, photograph wildlife. So let's get into it. I'm also out here today for the first time testing out a Canon 400mm 2.8. I usually use a 600mm f4 on my camera, but I have the opportunity to use a 400mm, and I'm going to be testing that lens out to see which one works best for my purposes. I'll be doing more of a comparison video between those two lenses later on, so if you're interested, stay tuned for that. But like I said, today is going to be all about the 7 tips and techniques that I think are most important to find and photograph wildlife. So the first 3 tips I'm going to share with you actually pertain to actually finding wildlife. So these tips are going to be useful for not only photographers but also bird watching, and also for other naturalists who just want to go out and observe nature. And the first 2 tips are also pretty similar, and I split them up into 2 because there's a little bit of a nuance between them, and I think that they both are very important and need to be highlighted separately. Stick around to the end of this video for an extra tip that I think is just very important in photography in general and can really up your game in finding and photographing wildlife. So without further ado, the first most important tip that I have in finding and photographing wildlife is doing research on the species you are trying to photograph. This is one of the most important things, and it's something you do before you even leave the house. This makes it so when you go out and try to find an animal to photograph, you're not just simply walking around the forest aimlessly hoping that you're going to come across an animal to photograph. Instead, this is back-end research that you can do before you leave the house. You can use Google. It's a variety of things you can find on Google. Type in a species you're looking for. You can also use other sources like books and online periodicals to do research. You can learn about the animal behavior. You can learn about the time of day the animal is active. You can learn about if there's anything behavioral that's really interesting about the animal that you might want to capture, and also can help you understand if there's any kind of behaviors as far as a time of season that might be interesting as well, as far as like ruts for a lot of ungulates and deer, elk, that sort of thing. If you're in the area out west, you can look at when a species gives birth to its young, so you can photograph the young of the species. So doing the research on the back end really helps you in finding the animal that you are actually trying to photograph. The second tip that I have is understanding the habitat that a species is going to be found in. Now this might sound really similar to the first one because you still have to do research on the species, but understanding the habitat that a species will be found in is going to make it so much easier to be able to find that species when you're out in the field. Now all wildlife is not going to be found in the same kind of habitat. The idea of wildlife habitat is kind of a made-up concept. It doesn't really exist because species are oftentimes associated with a particular habitat, and that is the best place to find them. So in this habitat that we're in right now, I'm in a mixed forest, and so there's a lot of pine trees, there's a lot of birch trees, and there's also ferns that are along the ground, but there's very little understory. So this would not be a good spot to look for, in my case, a common yellowthroat or a yellow warbler, things like that like shrubby habitat. So the idea of understanding what kind of habitat your species is going to be found in is going to make it a lot easier to find and photograph that species. Now going along with understanding the habitat preferences, understanding the food preferences of the species you're looking for can really aid in helping to find where that species might be found to photograph. For instance, in the Northeast in the fall, if you hang out around an eastern red cedar tree that has berries on it, you're going to find a lot of different species of birds that are coming forage on those berries because that is a perfect food source for them as they're migrating south in the fall. It's important to note as well that there's a lot of times when wildlife associate with a specific type of habitat during a particular time of year. So in a previous video, I shared how I was searching for black bears in the forest. So I specifically went down to wetland areas or places around brooks, because I know that black bears forage on skunk cabbage in the spring, because the skunk cabbage is one of the early food sources in this area. So a lot of times bears go down to these areas and forage on the skunk cabbage. So I knew that by going around water and following water, chances are I was going to have a good idea and a good chance of finding black bears, which is what I did. So if you want to watch that video in action and understand that concept a little bit more, I'll share a link to that video down below so you can check that one out as well. Now, the final tip that I have in regards to finding wildlife to photograph is learning to understand the signs and the tracks and the different things in the forest that can lead you to that species. So if you ever look carefully in the forest, I guarantee you probably have noticed or seen game trails as you're hiking along the forest. You see sections where the ground is depressed or the vegetation is pushed down, and this is spots where animals move through. Or you've seen scat on the ground, deer droppings, or different coyote droppings, or bear scat. These things can help you understand where a species might be found and can help you lead you to that species to photograph it. And it can kind of help you understand where the territory of a species might be as well, so you can kind of start to narrow down where that species might be found. Particularly if you're trying to photograph a species like a black bear that can be found in a variety of different habitats. Being able to track the scat and the footprints and the tracks through the area that you're in can really help you understand how that animal moves through the area habitat, and can kind of give you an insight into why that species is doing what it's doing, and maybe when and where that species is going. Now, before I reveal the last 5 tips that I have for finding and photographing wildlife, if you're enjoying this video, you're learning from it, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and the thumbs up button. I plan to release videos like this to kind of help each other learn, and different tips and techniques that I use to find wildlife every week from now on. So if you subscribe and hit that thumbs up, you'll be notified when that video is released, and you can also help spread the word to other people who are like-minded like you and me, who are just interested in nature, to find these videos as well. So thank you so much. Now, the remaining tips that I have for you assume that you now are able to find and locate wildlife, you understand how they behave, how they interact with the habitat, and these are now tips to help you get better pictures of those species when you're out in the field. So the number 4 tip that I have for you is scouting the area before you go out and plan to photograph the species that you're trying to photograph. Now, this kind of pertains to last video that I released, when I used a photo blind to help photograph white-tailed deer in a field. So I had been to this location multiple times. I knew that the species came through the field in a certain spot, so I was able to set up my blind in a particular spot and actually get some footage of the species interacting where I thought they were going to interact. I'll link this video below if you want to watch that video. But being able to scout the location ahead of time helps you understand how the light is going to enter that habitat, helps you identify any obstructions, any perches, and anything that might help you get better pictures of the species. So understanding how an animal might kind of enter a habitat, specifically if they're entering a food resource or a water resource, helps you get better pictures, helps you set up in advance so that while you're there to photograph the species, you're not going to spook it as much, hopefully. Now that you scouted the location out, you know how the wildlife is going to enter the area, you know where you're going to set up to photograph the species. The next tip I have for you is getting there before the wildlife shows up. It's always a problem when the wildlife is already in an area and you try to approach. Chances are you're going to end up scaring the wildlife away. Wildlife has amazing, depending on the species you're trying to photograph, they have amazing senses of smell and sight. For instance, a black bear has like 7 times the sense of smell as a bloodhound. So think about that next time you're creeping through a forest trying to photograph them. So being able to get to a location and set up before the species arrives allows the animal to come to you, allows it to be less disturbed and act more naturally, so you can hopefully get better pictures, more impactful pictures, and just have a better overall experience rather than being stressed out hoping that you're not going to scare an animal away. The 6th tip I have for you pertains specifically to mammals, and that is to place yourself upwind of where the animals are going to come from, or as you're approaching an animal to photograph. Mammals have such an incredible sense of smell, as I mentioned previously. if you try to approach an animal or set up in a spot where the animal is going to be able to smell you before they can see you or as they're approaching, chances are that mammal is going to turn around and go a different direction and you won't be able to get any pictures of it. So placing yourself so that the wind is blowing in your face instead of from behind you allows you to have a better chance of being able to get closer to wildlife and having wildlife not know that you are there photographing them, which leads to, again, more natural pictures and better experiences with the wildlife as you're photographing them. Now, the last tip that I have before the extra bonus tip pertains specifically to photographers, and that is to know your equipment. Wildlife move very fast, and a lot of time the action happens very quickly. So you need to be able to use your equipment effectively and efficiently so that if you need to change your settings quickly, you're able to do it on the fly instead of having to take your head away from the viewfinder and fiddle with your fingers to change the settings that you need to. Being able to know where all your settings are, change what you need to change without even thinking about it or looking at it will help you get better pictures, especially with fast-moving wildlife and birds in flight and that sort of thing. So that is the last tip I have for you. But now this is time for the bonus tip, and this pertains to everything in your life, not just wildlife photography and nature observation, but that is being patient. Being patient is one of the most important things in wildlife photography, especially when you set up in an area and you are waiting for the species to come to you. There's a lot of chances, a lot of times that as you're approaching a species, instead of just being patient and sitting where you are and letting the wildlife come towards you, by approaching the animal and rushing the situation, that animal likely flees or changes its behavior, becomes vigilant, and now even if you get a picture of it, you're going to get a picture of it staring right at you, or you're going to get a picture of it on alert and being worried, instead of if you just sat, waited, and were patient, allowed that animal to come towards you, allowed it to act naturally, you could get a lot more natural and more emotional pictures of that animal. Those are my 8 tips I have for you. I hope you enjoyed them. If you learned anything from them, or if you have any other tips of your own, please leave them in the comments below. Let me know if there's anything that I should add or anything that you found really helpful in your photography tips, because it's always nice to share it with everybody so that we can become better together and hopefully just be able to observe and enjoy nature a little bit better each time we go out. Now, this was by no means an exhaustive list of the tips and techniques that you can do to get great pictures, but this was just the tips that I thought were really important and just really a good foundation to be able to get better understanding of where wildlife are found and how they interact with the environment, and hopefully these things will help you be a better photographer as well, or just a bird watcher or nature observer, anything, a hiker. Just being able to find and enjoy wildlife is my main goal. So now that those are out of the way, I'm going to be quiet now, and hopefully some animals might come about. It's about 5 o'clock now, so this is about the time of day when deer start to come out and other animals. So this is a spot where I've seen deer and bear move through this area before. It's kind of a relatively open forest with some ferns on the ground, but you have good visibility because there's no undergrowth. So I'm just gonna sit quietly now, sit and wait, and hopefully some animals will come out. So until next time, I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.